Hi guys, welcome back to exmolex. Last week I shared some stories about Mormon apostle David A. Bednar and how many people who've had interactions with him feel that he's very cold, he can be rude, he's pretty full of himself and arrogant. And this is going to be part 2 because there are many more stories about David Bednar to share. Before we get started, I do just want to say this video is for entertainment purposes. So if you're here with a stick up your butt, just go do something else. This is not for you. This is supposed to be for fun. And also, I do want to turn this into a series. We could talk about more of the Lord's anointed. So let me know which prophet or apostle you want to hear about next, and I will put out a call to hear more of these stories. Without further ado, let's talk more about David Bednar. I went to an Institute fireside he and his wife were speaking at. There were a few things that struck me at the time, though I didn't think much of them, seeing as how I was a TBM at the time. The first was that no one would be allowed to speak with him afterwards. Sure enough, he and Sister Bednar took off right away after speaking, and we had to stay where we were until they were gone. Only after that were we allowed to go to the cultural hall and have refreshments. The other thing happened when his wife was speaking, and this caught me off guard even as a TBM. Sister Bednar said something to the effect of, "Don't worry, I know you're here to hear my husband, and I won't speak too long." Bednar piped up with, "I can prophesy with absolute certainty that won't be the case." It seems like a common theme with these stories that he belittles his wife and is just generally unkind to her. I used to really like Bednar when I was a kid because he seemed so much younger and therefore cooler than the other apostles. But back in 2006-ish, when I was 14 or so, Bednar came to my stake. The Saturday before the stake conference, Bednar did a special meeting with just the YSA. At the end of his talk, he gave them a special apostolic blessing, which I'm sure felt really special to everyone present. Apparently, after the YSA meeting closed, the young single adults began to chat, as human beings are known to do, in the chapel. Bednar was so incensed by their irreverence, he went to the podium and revoked his blessing. It shocked everyone so much that come the next day when I was at stake conference, everyone knew to be very quiet. I remember how terrified I felt and how this single asshole spooked several hundred people into timidity. Hated the guy ever since. Yeah, that seems like a pretty big overreaction. I worked with him while he was the president of BYU Idaho, and I worked in public relations just next to his office. I'd run into him several times a week on the way out of work. In the year and a half we worked with each other, he only ever asked me 2 questions. 1, where did you serve your mission? And 2, will you say the prayer? Once I was called to be a Sunday school instructor and asked him for his advice. He didn't give me any advice, but told me that usually those who don't know are the ones who speak, and those who do know don't speak. Another staff told me that they were waiting for the elevator once in the admin building. When it opened, Bednar seemed to be speaking harshly to Susan, and she was crying. Don't know any more than that. In all the time I knew him, he was hardline, cold, and impersonal. Falls right in line with all the other stories. My daughter was a student at Rick's College when Bednar was president of the school. She was running on the track. Very few people were on the track. Bednar came running up behind her and crashed really hard into the side of her for no apparent reason. It appeared to be deliberate. It was not to avoid other people because there were no others around. Was it because she was wearing shorts above the knee? He did not apologize or say excuse me. He didn't say a word. She just chalks it up to one of the weirdest, most baffling moments in her life. She has told me this story many times. My daughter has an athletic build and is tall at 5'11", which makes it even stranger. That is bizarre. I genuinely, I don't even know what to think about that. Bednar visited my mom's ward in California. We got a mysterious phone call inviting us to come to the church on Sunday, a different time than the regular meetings. Only just prior to the meeting did we learn this special session was being held because Bednar was visiting. Everything was very hush-hush. I can't recall for sure, but it seems like only Temple Recommend holders were invited. We were told we had to be in our seats something like 45 minutes before the meeting would start. He entered to the obligatory standing of the audience. His talk was a brag fest of how the 12 apostles served the One on their travels. These were stories of encounters where the 12 engaged with individual folks in need. He was the hero in some of the stories, so self-satisfied. After the meeting, people formed a long line that extended out the cultural hall to go up to shake his hand on the stand. My mother was on a walker, so she couldn't go up the steps. We had to wait till the hundreds of adoring fans shook his hand. Finally, someone asked him to come down from the stand to shake my mom's hand. At age 93, my mother had no social filter due to Alzheimer's. She was usually angry and belligerent. The first thing out of her mouth to Bednar was a rude, critical statement of me. He did not even look at me, seemed completely unaware of my presence. But Susan observed this embarrassing scene. She immediately greeted me, hugged me, and said something kind to smooth things over. David Bednar never did greet or even see me, the daughter/caregiver who had just been insulted by her mother. I was standing right next to my mom, but he never even turned to me to shake my hand. I blew it off because I was so used to my mother's bad behavior due to Alzheimer's, and I was on my way to being exmo and definitely did not want to shake his hand. It was interesting to me that the apostle of Jesus Christ didn't even notice, but his wife was the kind, observant person who immediately wanted to console me. We still have a bunch of stories to go, but based off of the ones that I've looked through, it seems like Susan is a really sweet person, and her husband is kind of the opposite of that. I cannot be named publicly, but about 8 years ago, I worked on a series of church videos for the church that involved Bednar. We were shooting a series of interviews with many of the general authorities at a soundstage in the church office building. By the time his interview came up, we had interviewed at least half of the Quorum of the 12. Most of them were cheerful and kind, some surprisingly nervous to be off teleprompter. But when Bednar arrived, that all changed. He was so incredibly cold and unapproachable. He didn't greet or shake any of the crew's hands as the others had done. There were multiple times we paused recording for one reason or another, and when we started again, he asked about where he had left off. The woman responsible for his tracking would start to answer him, but he never let her finish. He cut her off every time. This may seem small, but it was enough for a TBM at the time, like myself, to feel the spirit leave because of his rudeness. I felt hurt somehow. I remember telling my TBM wife that evening how rude and arrogant he acted. It was tough for me to even see a kind person in him at all after that. I think that's really interesting, particularly the contrast between David Bednar and the other members of the Quorum of the 12 that had been interviewed. I mean, I feel like obviously, they're all different people. They're all going to have different personalities, but you would expect that these people that are supposedly God's chosen prophets and apostles, seers and revelators, whatever, are going to be Christ-like, gentle people, the type of person that radiates Christ-like behavior, which I feel like would include kindness and warmth rather than this cold, arrogant thing that David Bednar has going on. Like, as an ex-Mormon, I don't think any of these guys are real apostles that actually commune with God or anything like that. But I do think that some of them have better energy than others. Like Dieter Uchtdorf would probably be my favorite one because he seems just like a kind person. I've never met the guy, so don't get me wrong. He could be none of those things. But at least on TV, he comes across as genuine and warm and like he would be nice to meet, whereas Bednar doesn't give off those vibes. I was at Rick's/BYUI during the Bednar years. It went from a fun, although Mormon school to a Mormon drone factory. Met Bednar several times, including having him in my apartment 4 or 5 times. My best Bednar story, however, is one that shows his personality best. I was involved with the athletic department during the changeover from 2-year Rick's to 4-year BYUI. For those who don't know, Rick's had a fairly successful athletic department and was a junior college football powerhouse. The decision had been made to cut all sports as part of the changeover, and many of us who were on the athletic scholarship wanted to know why. We felt that we could compete at the next level, and when I say that, I mean more Big Sky Conference than Big Ten. Also, through the program, we had baptized several people who had come on an athletic scholarship. So the opportunity came to have an FHE with the Bednars, and it just so happened that several of us in the chosen FHE groups were student athletes and support personnel who would be losing our scholarships and had never been told why. So when he opened the meeting to questions, we asked him. Many of us were expecting some sort of empathy, maybe somewhere along the lines of, I understand it may be hard to lose your department, but it's a money thing, etc. Instead, we were basically told how dare we question the brethren and that we had such small faith and the brethren know better than us. He went on for 45 minutes of basically calling us useless for questioning why we were losing our scholarships. Yikes. He seems like the type of person that, first of all, does not want to be questioned and views any sort of questioning as an attack on him, which is something that narcissists often do. When I went to BYUI, David Bednar was the school's president. He became an apostle during my freshman year. Shortly thereafter, I took a health class. It was geared specifically for women. The teacher was in a state of ecstasy about having worked with an apostle, and much like a girl with a crush, she talked about him way too often. She inflated their encounters to give the impression that they shared inside jokes together. She said something about how each time he'd helped her out, she told him she'd bake him a pie. She was giddy when she said, I told him I owe him 6 or 7 pies. This unconscious innuendo just poured out of her. Her favorite story to tell, which I'm sure she told to every single class, was about oral. She wanted to know the church's stance for educational purposes, of course, so she wrote an email to her good pal David. When she told this story, she described the dithering before she finally worked up the courage to hit send and how she squealed the moment afterward. A moment later, her phone rang. It was David Bednar. He told her that oral sex was one-sided, essentially discouraging/prohibiting the act. You might think she, being an educator on women's health, would give him a female perspective on the importance of oral in preparation for intercourse. But did she? No. Instead, she gave us the apostolic insight that we'd better not do it after we're married. So what do I know about David Bednar? He's ignorant about female sexuality, he's arrogant enough to advise young people on the subject, and undoubtedly, hands down, the man is bad in bed. That is a very, I can't even wrap my mind around this professor telling everybody this. Like, I think that even like as a true believing Mormon, I would be, first of all, embarrassed to ask that kind of question to an apostle, but even after having received an answer, like, I don't think that I would just go around telling people about that. I don't know. That's kind of strange. Very strange. I don't know. You guys have to let me know what your thoughts are about that. I was a missionary for the church in 2006 and 2007 in the Budapest, Hungary mission. Elder Bednar was the only apostle to visit during my mission. He came for a zone conference. He did half the mission at a time, so he did 2 of those sessions total. He told us at the beginning of the hour that he had no agenda and was going to run the session as a live Q&A. We could ask him any questions we wanted. Before he started, he also made expressly sure we knew there were in fact dumb questions and that we shouldn't ask things like, where is the sword of Laban? There were 2 points specifically that stand out to me. The first was a question raised by a sister missionary. She stood up and very anxiously/nervously asked him, "What do you do when nobody wants to talk to you? I go day in, day out from door to door and nobody wants to hear the gospel. How do you stay motivated when..." She was visibly anxious and a little shaky. I think this was probably a mixture of her meeting an apostle for the first time and the inherent anxiousness of being a 21-year-old missionary with all the obedience brings blessings, exact obedience brings miracles type messaging that goes with it. He cut her off mid-sentence and knife-handed, putting your thumb near your palm and pointing at someone with all 4 fingers, her, saying, "Stop it. You're being a fanatic. Sit down." Oh my God. He then explained the path to God is straight and narrow. There are 2 ways of going off the path. One is to go to the left, which is being lax in the gospel and not doing everything you know you should. The second is to go to the right, which is being a fanatic. He told us in no uncertain terms that if we must deviate, we should always choose the left path. If you go to the left, you feel bad knowing you aren't living up to the gospel, and I guess guilt will eventually pull you back in. But if you leave the path to go right, you become a fanatic and will apply the scriptures to proving you're not wrong and that everyone else in the church is. He felt like people don't come back after becoming fanatics. So yeah, an apostle told me to sin a little because that's better than taking the gospel too seriously, I guess. I think this reassurance that you don't need to be a fanatic probably helped me stay in the church longer than I could have otherwise. I was fairly orthodox and really didn't do anything too off from the mainstream gospel. Didn't drink, drugs, sex, etc. But I think it also set me up with a false sense of superiority towards people in the church that I thought were being too serious about the church. That's really strange. I just recently watched a video about David Bednar at another Q&A session where he gives a little boy advice on what to do if you don't feel like reading the scriptures or if you're not doing a good job of remembering to read your scriptures every day. The advice that he gave, I feel like, was pretty opposite of this. I'm gonna leave a link in the description if you guys want to go look at it. It's actually kind of disturbing. I feel like he puts his hands on that child way more than he should as an authority figure, as a man, as somebody that's essentially a stranger to this kid. The whole thing is really uncomfortable, but like, it's just if you want to watch that and compare it to this experience, like, it's very different. I'm not sure how I feel about it. The second point was the point he's since made several times since then about free agency. He'd ask, "Why do we have free agency?" rhetorically, and then answer that we don't have free agency so we can choose whatever you want. You only have free agency so you can choose what God wants. He didn't give you the right to choose just so you could make your own choices. He argued that when we respect other people's free agency, like parents respecting their children/teens' right to choose to go to church or not, that it's a mistake, if not an overt sin even, because Satan isn't sitting on the sidelines honoring their free agency either. So forcing your kids to go to church or get baptized or go on a mission, etc., is exactly what you must do, because otherwise Satan's going to get them, I guess. So neither you nor your kids get to be free or to decide how you go through life. Free agency was the shelf item that I could never get fully off my shelf. It simmered in the background for years until I finally had to address it, and I wonder if that was the point when it first hit me as not feeling right. I hate that I then felt like I had to do what the church-approved plan for my life wanted me to do. From marrying early and divorcing 2.5 years later, transferring into BYU because I was made to feel like my life literally could not be successful anywhere else, and so many other things over the years. I never really felt fully free in making decisions that would actually have been the best for my life, and I resent resent that deeply for stealing my actual free agency from me. There were other things he brought up / recycled in that session, like the faith is stepping out of the light and into darkness talk he gave in conference a few years later. At this point in my life, I was oblivious that these guys all have these pre-canned talking points and metaphors / examples that they practice for years. I thought we were getting specially inspired topic responses specifically targeted at what Christ himself needed us to hear right then. Nope. Very interesting. I feel like you can see that not just with apostles, but like older people in the church that have grown up in the same eras of the church. They usually have the same sort of metaphors that they will use in their talks or in their lessons or in their testimonies. Elder Bednar came to reorganize our stake when I was in Young Men's. His wife was speaking and he got up and corrected her. It seemed more in jest, but it upset me that he wasn't gentle with his spouse and embarrassed her in front of everyone. Just an overall abrasive personality, although maybe he was just grumpy since it was his birthday. I remember people at Institute saying he would probably be the prophet someday, and I just set it aside since I didn't know if I could be okay with him in that position. My first 2 semesters at BYU-I were part of David Bednar's last year as president of BYU Idaho before he was called to the Quorum of the 12. Our student ward had an FHE with him and Susan. A little bit of background, my mom joined the church when she married my stepdad, so I'm not sealed to anyone. I'd always worried about that since I understood that you couldn't make it to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom without being sealed to your family. Plus, I didn't want to be floating around in the universe without anyone. During a Q&A, I asked him about that. I can't remember his exact words, but he blew me off as if it was a stupid question and I shouldn't worry about it. Just be faithful to the brethren and I'd be fine. I really struggled when he was called to the 12 while I was a missionary. Although it took me almost a decade after I graduated from BYU-I to stop believing, his disregard of my concerns and his attitude as an apostle were part of why I left the church. Yeah, that's really mean. You think that he would be more comforting and less abrasive about it? Like, how hard would it have been instead of being like, well, that's just a dumb question, don't worry. Instead to be like, I understand why you would be concerned about that, but as an apostle of the Lord, I can promise you that nobody's going to be disappointed when they get to heaven and everything is going to be taken care of and you will have your family with you as long as you obey the gospel or something like that, just to make it like sound nicer. I was David Bednar's home teacher just prior to and for a bit after he was called to be an apostle. I was a newly minted teacher at the time, so around 13, 14 years old. I'll start off with a couple funny things about him. If you look closely when he laughs, which I know is hard considering what a stick in the mud he can be, he laughs like a skeleton. If you imagine a cartoon skeleton laughing, it just moves its jaw up and down and he does the same thing. Slower and more subtly, but noticeable. If you notice his hair, it's always the same. Not a single hair is out of place. Well, there was one time that the bishopric decided that we needed to test our food storage and disaster preparedness by going 1 whole week without power and try to only live off of our food stores. Weird, I know, but this was Rexburg, Idaho, so it sort of makes sense that they would do something like that. Well, a lot of people looked a little haggard and disheveled, no doubt to show off how righteous they were being. But David always looked exactly the same. We couldn't figure out why until one day someone went to the church early for some reason. I don't remember. But when we were there, they saw David in the bathroom with the hair dryer he brought from home getting ready. I guess it was okay to use the church building's power and stuff as long as he wasn't using his own. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. I remember when I was probably like 8th, 9th, 10th grade, starting seminary, we had to memorize all the names of all the apostles, and so we would like memorize their names with their picture. And David Bednar, everybody always remembered him because his hair looked really good, like it was perfectly coiffed at all times. Now you know he uses a blow dryer to achieve that look. And for some less funny things, he, of all the people I ever home taught, was the most difficult to get a hold of. He was the president of RIC/BYU-I and had some other callings, I believe, so he was always gone, which was honestly fine. It mostly meant that my dad, who was my partner at the time, and I would just visit with his wife herself, seeing as they were empty nesters by then. She was, and I imagine still is, a lovely person and super sweet, but I feel this situation was a bit of a microcosm of Mormonism as a whole. The guy is off doing important things and receiving a lot of recognition, but the wife is left as a side character in the man's story. But on the occasions we did actually get an appointment with him, one of the first things you would notice when walking in would be the perfectly parallel vacuum lines in their perfectly white carpet. Well, not really their carpet, as the house was owned by the church and used for the president of the college. Yard care, snow removal, etc. included, and that sort of sterility was all over their house. Everything was in its proper place and perfectly organized and clean, sort of like no one lived there at all. So we would go inside, take off our shoes, sit down on their couch and start the lesson with a prayer. And if David was there, we had to stand to pray. pray, even if it was just my dad, me, and him. I remember a time when we had just received a lesson in priesthood about the rule of thumb being when in a group of 5 or more, then you should stand to pray, but you don't need to if there are 4 or fewer. You know, covering the important things that God would really care about. So I didn't stand to pray at the start of a lesson when it was just the 4 of us. He stopped me mid-prayer and made me stand up and start over. Oh my gosh. After the opening prayer, we would go into the lesson. My dad and I alternated preparing and giving the lesson every other month, and when it was my turn, David would quiz me on the lesson I gave. It's been 20 years since then, so I don't remember any specifics, but looking back on it, it was pretty obnoxious, him grilling a 14-year-old on all these niche things from the lesson they gave. My time as his home teacher lasted maybe a couple years. I don't remember exactly, but my takeaway from him as a person was that he was pleasant on his own terms. If you acted, spoke, thought, organized, etc. the way he wanted, he was pleasant enough. Still a bit of a stick in the mud, but affable. His controlling side would show if anything other than what he wanted happened. I think about Susan a lot and what her life must be like. I can only speculate, but I can't think she is anything other than claustrophobic being married to David. But maybe she's used to it, or that's the kind of thing she wanted and feels comfortable with. The way that that's like not even surprising based on all of the stories that we've heard and the way that I've seen him interact in videos with especially children, the idea of him grilling you on the lesson you gave sounds super in line with videos I've seen of him. I will say the part about the vacuum lines in the carpet and everything being very neat and orderly made me laugh because that's how I keep my house also. Like, I know that some people don't do it that way, but I really thrive on my home being very clean and neat and orderly, and I love when there's vacuum lines in the carpet. And I bet you that it was really Susan that was taking care of all that, so I feel like her and I have that in common. I've spent 2 hours behind closed doors with Bednar as a former member of an LDS stake presidency. His arrogance was unbelievable. I found it to be 2 of the worst hours I have ever spent as a member of the church. My experiences with him have impacted my testimony. After my time with him, I am convinced he is not a prophet, seer, revelator, or apostle. At least not one that the Jesus of the New Testament would have anything to do with. He spent the first 15 minutes making sure we understood how fortunate we were to have the keys in our stake. He reminded us that out of the many places in the world where he could be, our stake was chosen, and we should carefully consider why one of the Lord's anointed is spending part of the weekend with us. He then sat smugly while we tried to come up with answers to this incredible privilege. He seemed irritated when we couldn't point out anything profound. We were experiencing the same challenges as every other stake in the world. People leaving in high numbers, youth disengaged, non-existent ministering numbers, missionaries returning early, mostly uninspiring worship services, etc. He didn't offer any solutions to our problems you would expect from someone who can see around corners. His tone was condescending and unfriendly, and there was no genuine warmth in his demeanor. He reminded me of what it was like to be in the presence of Boyd Packer. Yeah, I've hung out with him too. Basically, it felt like he was a corporate representative, not an emissary of Jesus. I felt liberated by the fact that he was just an ordinary guy that I wouldn't want to grab a burger with, let alone look to for guidance from on high. Last thing, he did everything he could to avoid interacting with our stake members. He stood up and walked out to his car immediately after the special meeting with his security detail and didn't look back. Everyone was so disappointed. I met him many years ago. He was so condescending and arrogant that I began to wonder if he was truly an apostle of the Lord. He was all about making people do things instead of respecting their free agency. By the time we were finished, I couldn't help but think the A of his middle initial most likely stands for asshole. Later, I heard many refer to him as Darth Bednar. David Asshole Bednar and Darth Bednar are both very fitting. I met him at a fireside in Alabama when I was about 13 or 14. I agree with the sentiment that he seems cold. He didn't smile except for when everyone stood for him when he entered. Imagine that. I shook his hand and remembered thinking he was short and had nothing in his eyes. I had expected warmth, like when I met Uchtdorf. Susan Bednar seemed sweet, but very sad. I used to be a banquet server at LDS Church headquarters. Every month, all of the wives of the general authorities would get together to have a catered lunch. I noticed that Susan, his wife, always had a haunted and sad look in her eyes. Really nice lady, but her demeanor was that of a whipped puppy. Well, based off of everything that we've learned about David Bednar and the way that he treats his wife and the way that he treats other people, that makes perfect sense. That's all the stories about David Bednar I have to share with you today. If you have more, please leave them in the comments. I'm sure that people will be reading them to see what else we can find out about this guy. I have a few apostles that I feel like are my least favorites. I've never met any, but there are some that I think of and I'm like, don't like that guy. That would include like Bruce R. McConkie, Spencer W. Kimball, Dallin H. Oaks. David Bednar seems particularly asshole-ish. Let me know if you guys want to see more videos like this, and maybe we can delve into more of those other guys and see if really David Bednar is the worst of them all. Thank you guys so much for watching. Special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. I appreciate you guys so much. Extra special thank you to Doug Davis for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. If you guys would like to support the channel, there are links to do so in the description below. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.